Hello and welcome to this episode of the Signum Symposium. We're very glad to have you here today with our special guest, Alexander Ames. I will come back and introduce him shortly, but I just want to welcome everyone and tell you about some upcoming events. And thank you all for being here. So I am Sørina Higgins, the chair of the Language and Literature Department here at Signum. And we're glad to have those of you who are here live and those who are watching later. If you would like to help support this event and everything that Signum University and the Mythgard Institute do, then please go to signumuniversity.org/donate and donate to us today so that we can continue bringing you these great lectures and all kinds of other events. Speaking of events, you probably all know about upcoming events, but I just want to make sure that you do. And whichever ones I don't mention, you can go to signumuniversity.org/events and check those out. The biggest one, of course, is that registration for Mythmoot 6 is now open. The theme of Mythmoot 6 is dragons. So if you would like to be where there be dragons, then come to Leesburg, Virginia at the end of June. And early bird registration is only open for about another week and a half or so, and then prices go up. So do check that out. Do register to come and join us in person, because this is our one big national, or I could even say international conference when we all get to meet in person. And of course, the call for papers is also open for any papers, even tangentially related to dragons, or I expect some other liminal and mythical beasts would also be welcome. And you can check out the amazing special guests who have already been confirmed. There's Jacob Rogers, designer and writer for The Adventures in Middle-earth and the One Ring role-playing game. There's Katie McDaniel, who is a Harry Potter scholar and has a podcast on J.K. Rowling. And Diana Glyer, author of The Company They Keep and Bandersnatch, award-winning writer of one of the Mythopoeia Inklings Scholarship Awards, and I must say a marvelous public speaker, very inspirational. So I hope you can join us there. Also check out our regional moots. I know we have Sunshine Moot coming up in Florida very soon, and I think the next one after that is in the Netherlands. And of course, we always have our full slate of online events, so check out Lord of the Rings online, Mythgard Academy classes, and so forth. For those of you who are interested in getting credit for courses at Signum University, registration for summer classes is already open. So you definitely want to take a look at that. Wonderful courses coming up. I personally am very excited about the Inklings and King Arthur, which will be debuting as a live course this summer. And if you're here to listen to Tolkien and medieval romance today, then of course you're one who is interested in the Inklings and King Arthur. All right, so that's what I wanted to announce. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And let me introduce our special guest today. Alexander von Ames has studied both art and English. He has an MA in English from the University of Alabama and a PhD in English with a specialty in Old and Middle English language and literature from St. Louis University, where his supervisor was our beloved Tom Shippey. He also has a graduate certificate in medieval studies from St. Louis University's Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And he has worked on apocryphal contributions to Middle English manuscript, early print traditions, including Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and has also looked at linguistic influences as well. And he's taught in a wide variety of settings, and we are very glad to welcome him to lecture to us today about Tolkien and medieval romance. So as he talks, please do send in your questions. We may look at those throughout, or we may save for a Q&A at the end. So, Dr. Ames, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Welcome. All right, well, I'm going to hide my webcam and you can take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Sørina. Good morning, everybody. Again, thanks for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So let me just dive right in. One of the great splits in English literary history is the move from epic to romance, which is often associated with the Norman conquest. People often tended to look at Tolkien as a practitioner of epic, which of course he was, but he was clearly very interested in romance as well. There's a national element in this because although 12th century romance is often thought of as a French development, one of the really strange things is that it has an obvious Celtic substratum or basis, derived either from Breton or Welsh or maybe both. So if not English, it's at least sort of British. It's worth noting that Professor Shippey, who self-identifies as a well-known chauvinist, always points out that the really important works in Old French usually came from England, like the Lays of Marie de France, who, in spite of her name, came from England. We see Tolkien's investment in epic in his scholarly work on Beowulf and creatively in The Lord of the Rings, but both his creative output and his scholarship were heavily influenced in, and his fiction was significantly influenced by medieval romance. And let me move on to the first slide. We'll get to that definition in a moment. For evidence of the former, that is the influence of medieval romance and his interest in it in his scholarship, we don't have to look any further than his 1925 edition with E.V. Gordon of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, his 1953 lecture on the poem at the University of Glasgow, which of course became an essay, and his 1975 posthumous translation, or posthumously published translation of the poem along with Sir Orfeo and Pearl. We see evidence of Tolkien's keen and abiding interest in medieval romance, in particular the subgenre of the Breton Lay, in his repeated poetic and prosaic uses of and references to the tale of Beren and Luthien, the quest motifs central to the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, his poem, The Lay of Autru and Itrun, I got to make sure I'm saying that right, and in his unfinished poem, The Death of Arthur, as well as elsewhere. Tolkien's efforts at writing romance in authentically medieval styles function not only as homages to the genre, but sincere contributions to it, extending its life beyond the chronology of the Middle Ages. In fact, one might go so far as to suggest that Tolkien's most explicit efforts at writing romance play with the structures and most conventional focus of the genre in interesting ways, suggesting an insider's perspective. But before that sort of speculation is really possible, much less apt, it may be useful at this point to offer some attempt at defining the genre of romance, particularly medieval romance, though to generalize in doing so is an inherently flawed exercise given the variety of plot formulae, themes, and styles of diverse examples of the genre written in the Middle Ages, in latter imitation of those models, and, as in Tolkien's case, in latter use of various of the genre's conventions. So it may be useful to begin as such august scholars as Tom Shippey and John Bowers, whose book Tolkien's Lost Chaucer is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, I think, in the fall, I believe, with the place of romance in Northrop Frye's conception of literary modes. Frye's definition of romance among his 5 categories, going along with myth, high mimesis, low mimesis, and irony, or the ironic, which might cover farce. In myth, characters are divine. We need not look any further than to the kinds of myths on which Tolkien drew, as well as those he created for Middle Earth and beyond. In the novel, which we would probably describe as high mimesis, readers and characters are basically on the same level. And we need to look to that model or that mode in some respects when we look at works like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In romance, which is really in between epic, which would also fall under the heading of high mimesis, I think, we see a situation where you have characters who are superior to both their environment and to other characters. They can do things that people can't. And here, if you look at the highlighted bit of this slide, you'll see what I'm talking about. Characters are capable of surviving things like beheading, such as we see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, capable of entry into fairy or fairyland, as we see this in works like Sir Orfeo. They're capable of performing or claiming to perform magic, as in Chaucer's Franklin's Tale. So I also think we could do worse than to consider John Finlayson's definition of romance, which I quote here from his article in the Chaucer Review, Definitions of Middle English Romance. And I'll just read it. It's pretty brief. By almost common consent, all narratives dealing with aristocratic personae and involving combat and or love are called romances if written after 1100. As a loose, deliberately inclusive way of categorizing narrative poems, this has some merit in distinguishing them from rustic tales, homilies, satires, histories, and allegories. However, the term romance is also used to indicate a system of values and at the same time a method of treatment. This is pretty broad and inclusive. What's a little bit more specific and to the point, you get from Wimtig's Romance and Parody and Companion to Middle English Romance. Here he focuses on the quest. The character who's either aristocratic or would like to be aristocratic, undertakes an adventure, as he puts it, I would just say a quest, and by successfully fulfilling the quest, pleases his lord, be that an earthly lord or a spiritual lord or his lady. Basically, he reifies the status quo. Others have defined romance as a kind of wish fulfillment. And that certainly syncs with what Tigges has noted there, I think. This seems reasonable enough. The audiences and readerships of narratives about the chivalric class and or those who would like to be members of it would undoubtedly like to have their class and aesthetic prerogatives validated. Many medieval romances do this, ending as they do in weddings or couplings, or the rewards of mostly successful quest knights who have bested the beastie, secured the safety of, or at least upheld the reputation of the fair maiden, or validated the rule of their lord or the truth of their god. To put a finer point on it, many romances serve not only to uphold, but to valorize that social status quo that I mentioned a moment ago. This isn't to suggest that their values and their interest in sort of validating the status quo are insincere or ironic. For the chivalric or would-be chivalric or even the shadow chivalric class, which we see in some romances, especially those that lean a little bit more towards the chanson de geste. Sometimes you see a kind of more middle-class version of the narrative, and here I'm thinking of things like the Tale of Gamlin, which slips into some of the manuscripts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but which is not really about a knightly quest, such as we see in works like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Anyway, characters in medieval romance typically respect each other, or at least they take each other seriously, unless they have reason not to do so, as in the case of Sir Lanval, or even in Marie de France's Lanval, which is its basis. Here, the title character disapproves of the would-be queen and then later Queen Guinevere's reputation for, let's say a less than conventional commitment to maidenly chastity. And love is supposed to be permanent. So for Lanval, this represents a failing on her part, so great a failing that he has to leave the court. But we'll get back to Lanval in a bit. So it's really no surprise that Tolkien would have gravitated to and been so influenced by the genre of medieval romance, given the extent to which his work, both as a scholar and as a creative author, focused on the details of language, upon what some might refer to as technicalities. For no genre of writing in the history of the English language, perhaps, I would suggest, is the devil so very much in the details as it is in medieval romance, where plots hinge upon the efficacy and characters' understandings of objects, magical and ordinary, the behaviors of beasts and people, magical and ordinary, the rules of social engagement, which reflect not only the values of the imagined societies, but also their foils in fairy or in fairy land. Again, we'll get to how Tolkien defined fairy in a moment. Is in this engagement with the Fae, that is the agents of fairy, specifically those we might refer to as elven and or the very realm of fairy itself, which characterizes much of Tolkien's relationship with the genre, specifically the subgenre of the Breton Lay. And I think that there's enough evidence here and much more that we could not possibly cover today, which does suggest a pretty substantial relationship. This isn't merely for Tolkien the object of a study or an inspiration for something he wrote. Aspects of romance, in particular those that we find in the more fairy-focused romances that are referred to as Breton Lay, or which seem to borrow heavily from that subgenre, are central to so much of what Tolkien did as a scholar and what he wrote as a creative author. Anyway, so moving on, let's try and put a little bit finer point on what we mean by the Breton Lay, because if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't read many or any of these novel or not novels, these narratives, sorry, then they might. This may not. What I'm about to talk about may not be immediately obvious. So. Anyway, the Breton Lay, for all of Tolkien's investment in the sort of broad scope romance typical of, say, medieval renditions of the Arthurian narrative as a whole, or in large part, Malory's Mort, the alliterative Mort Arthur, the stanzaic Mort Arthur, as evidenced by The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's unfinished poem, The Fall of Arthur, the Breton Lay seems to have been his favorite subgenre or style of romance because it is so focused on fairy. And excuse me again. Maybe that's a fairy reaching out to me. Because it's so focused on fairy and its juxtaposition to humanity. Tolkien's most obvious use of the Breton Lay genre is his 1925 poem, The Lay of Autru and Itrun, in which he faithfully employs elements common to the subgenre of romance, that is the Breton Lay, but in which he also adapts these to his own purpose, which is where he differs from most authors of medieval examples and perhaps their pre-medieval antecedents. Tolkien's greatest scholarly engagement with the Breton Lay would seem to be his anonymously published edition of Sir Orfeo in 1944 and his posthumously published translation of the poem with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl in 1975. But what exactly distinguishes a Breton Lay from other types of romance and entirely other genres of literature? Well, here I'm going to turn to... Oh, sorry, I need to go back and oh, I've lost my spot. Sorry, here we go. So sorry you're seeing my slides on the side. I know it's not as seemly, but I needed to move back. So anyway, as you can see here, Anne Laskaya and Eve Salisbury, in their introduction to their 1995 Teams edition of the Middle English Breton Lay, addressed this question of trying to define this genre or subgenre or type of romance. It's been one that's gotten a lot, it's gotten a lot of thought. They look at what A.C. Baugh had to say, that effectively, and you can read this for yourself, so I won't read all of it out, but effectively, whether or not something's a Breton Lay is whether or not it claims to be a Breton Lay. There are often references to the fact that this poem or poems like it were sung by harpers in Brittany or Bretagne. They don't really distinguish between Brittany and Britain. And that makes a kind of sense given the kind of linguistic fluidity that there would have been in, pre-modern, between pre-modern or even early medieval Breton and Welsh, and other, I guess what we would call, P-Celtic languages anyway. So anyway, what's important about the lays themselves is not whether or not they necessarily that they refer to having been made in Brittany, or that they are found among, or that they translate certain of the lays of Marie de France, but it's that they include particular elements. And Dr. Shippey, in a couple of his articles on the subject, has mentioned a couple of the elements that seem to be common to the Breton Lay. One is a rash promise. Here you can see the human character, typically the protagonist, who has either been taken into fairy, or has had fairy visit him or her, or has sought it out, being involved in some kind of situation where you've got himself, or perhaps the king of fairy, or another character making a rash promise that will get them in trouble later on. In Sir Orfeo, for example, where we see the English king, have to seek out his wife Herodes in fairyland, where she's been abducted by the king of fairy. It's the elf king or the fairy king who makes a promise on the basis of Orfeo's excellence with the harp to give him whatever he desires. In The Wife of Bath's Tale, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it's the promise that the knight, the unnamed Arthurian knight, makes to the lovely lady. In Tolkien's Outru and Itrun, it's Outru's pledge to pay the Corrigan, who's a sort of a loathly lady witch character, to pay her fee, which he doesn't specify, in exchange for a fertility potion with which he can enable his wife to secure his legacy and have children, which she does. Balancing the motif of the rash promise is the theme of gentillesse or magnanimity. The elf king keeps his word, and here we see this also in Beren and Luthien. Thingol, though, he has to be reminded of this by Beren, ultimately fulfills his promise to give Luthien to Beren, or allow their union, if Beren fulfills his promise to have in his hand a cimoril, which he does, even though it happens to be in a wolf's belly at the time. He's not happy about this, but ultimately he does do it. In Chaucer's Franklin's Tale, the husband tells the wife she must keep her promise, and the lover releases her from her promise. And the magician releases the lover from his debt. In Sir Lanval and Marie de France's Lanval, the fairy queen figure, the fairy woman figure, rescues her lover Lanval, even though he's broken their arrangement by letting people know about the nature of their relationship. With Outru, we see this gone wrong, but we'll get into that in a little bit more depth later on. I want to look in a little bit more depth at, I want to talk a little bit more about Sir Orfeo for a minute, because, and I apologize, somehow these got out of order. Yeah, okay. I'll just stick here for a moment. I want to talk a little bit more about Sir Orfeo for a moment, because if you're not familiar with the narrative, this is a great example, not only because it was so important to Tolkien himself. He did spend a lot of time and put a lot of effort into it, but because it was clearly an influence on his later uses of genre, in particular the Breton Lay type of type of romance. Queen Herodes is driven to self-mutilation after being propositioned by the King of Faerie to live with him eternally in his realm. When she has fallen asleep under an impa tree, there's a grafted tree, and her and her husband's orchard. That is, it's their own property. It is part of their lands. It's part of their home. So here we have what I describe elsewhere as an instance of fairy coming to court or coming into one's domain, even if it's under the cover of sleep. And really we see in the Breton Lay, both in the examples of that I've mentioned here that are listed on the slide, and in Tolkien's own work with this genre, we see two kinds of engagements with the fairy other. One is when fairy comes to you, fairy invades. The other is when you, or the human character, the human protagonist, goes in search of fairy. Sir Orfeo, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, though not technically a Breton Lay, still heavily engaged with fairy, features this kind of motif. So anyway, Orfeo tries to protect Herodes with his knights, but she's abducted anyway. She originally woke screaming from her dream, where she was visited by the King of Faerie, tore at her face. She's been told, if you don't come with us, we're going to abduct you. Ultimately, this happens in spite of Orfeo's best efforts. He rejects his crown, leaves his throne in the hands of his steward, goes to live in the woods for a period of 10 years or more. He frequently sees in the wilderness the elf king's company, the fairy king's company, including his wife Herodes, but he can't reach her. And only when one time he follows them into a cave is he able to enter into the land of fairy. And there we see him masquerade, because his reputation, I mean, obviously, if you know the Orpheus myth, you know that he's renowned as a harper. Well, Sir Orfeo, even though remade as a medieval king, is also renowned as a harper. He's able to masquerade as a minstrel. I mean, he certainly doesn't look the part of the king at this point, and gains access to the court of the King of Faerie, whom he so impresses with his skill with the harp that the king promises to give Orfeo his reward. I mentioned this a few minutes ago. Orfeo takes advantage of this rash promise. Here again, we see the rash promise motif, and requests Herodes as his reward. When the king objects, Orfeo holds him to his promise, and Orpheus and Herodes are able to return to their earthly realm, which happens to be in Winchester in this version of the story, where his steward, who has been ruling in his stead, welcomes him as a harper in remembrance of the king, who he assumes still to be dead. When Orfeo plays, the steward recognizes the harp, but Orfeo claims that he has found the harp on the body of a dead man, or near the body of a dead man. When this account moves the steward to tears, Orfeo reveals himself, resumes his throne, and is commemorated by British harpers who compose a lay in his honor. Just a moment, let me find the next slide. And sorry, part of this is missing. So I'm going to read these opening lines to you. They were supposed to be here in the slide, but they're not. Apologies. Because I mentioned before that one of the things that makes a Breton Lay is the fact that it proclaims that it is. And they very frequently, they begin very similarly, almost formulaically, we could say. And Sir Orfeo is a great example of this. So these are the opening lines from Tolkien's own 1944 edition of the poem. We raiden oft in fiend Eureta, as Clercus don us to wita. The lays that bin of harpain, bin yefund of fairly thing. Some bin of wela and some of woe, and some of joy and mirth also. Some of treacheria and some of gila, and some of hapas that fallen behuila. Some of Bordas and some of Ribalde, and some there been of the Ferrier. Of all a thing that men may say, most of love, forsooth they be. In Britain these lays on ye writ, first ye found, and forth ye get, of aventures that fallen bedies, whereof Britons mad her lays. When they o'er micht ye heron, of aventures that there weren, they took the harpas, though with gamma, mada lay, it nama, of aventures that han befall. Ye can some tella, but nocht alla, herken laudings that been true, and ye will yo tella of Sir Orfeo. Excuse me, this type of opening is extraordinarily typical. We see it in poems like Sir Launfal. We see it in Chaucer's Wife of Bass' Tale, though that there's a bit more irony in that poem. We see it in some respects in Chaucer's Franklin's Tale. But I want to go on and talk about a couple of other examples that I think may also have been influential on Tolkien before we try and start detailing where this shows up in his creative writing. So in Sir Launfal, again, you have a knight who leaves the court despite his great reputation and his role as steward of Arthur's court because he can't abide Guinevere's reputation for immorality. To be blunt, she already has the reputation when she arrives at Arthur's court for having a lot of boyfriends besides the king, and Launfal can't abide that. He leaves with the king's blessing, as well as a couple of King Arthur's unnamed nephews. The king promises him wealth, but that doesn't actually appear to go with him. So when Launfal finds himself in a town on Trinity Sunday where there's a great feast, he's not invited. His appearance, because his ultimate lack of material wealth, has prevented him from going to church. But he goes riding, and there he's greeted instead of going to church and going to the feast. He's greeted by two maidens on behalf of their mistress Triamore, who happens to be the daughter of the fairy king. So here we see another example of fairy coming not exactly to court, but coming into the human realm. Fairy invading, as it were. He encounters a beautiful and semi-nude fairy who declares her love for him, and offers him magical gifts, a horse, a squire. He accepts. They dine. They go to bed. In the morning, she warns him to keep their love a secret. If he boasts about it, he'll lose her. So this is another important element of the Breton Lay, which is what I wanted to talk about Launfal as well, is, excuse me, this motif of the bargain. Again, we see that in other examples, and we see it here. We see it here as well. Launfal returns to the town, Caerleon, where he was before. He snubs the mayor, pays off his debts, has rich feasts, while his fairy lover visits him nightly. Again, she only can visit him sort of in secret. He wins a tournament held in his own honor and travels to Lombardy to defeat the fearsome Sir Valentine. Arthur hears of Launfal's success and invites him to a feast. Guinevere propositions him during a dance, and when he refuses, she accuses him of loving no women, of loving men instead. Lanval responds that the loveliest maid is his lover, far more beautiful than the queen. In doing so, he breaks his promise to Triamor. His riches immediately disappear. Arthur threatens to hang him. After Guinevere claims that he's propositioned her, that he's approached her in a sexual sense, and invented a mistress. The jury of knights decide that, considering the reputation of the queen, Lanval should be acquitted. Again, this sort of reifies his doubts about her, the fact that other knights of Arthur's own court had similar ideas. Guinevere replies that if he produced a fair woman, she will be blinded. On the appointed day, the knight admits that he cannot summon his lover and awaits punishment. 20 beautiful maidens enter the court and approach the king, but Lanval admits that none of these are his lady. Sensing that her downfall is near, she urges the king to punishment, but then Triamor herself rides into court. Again, you can see flashes of this sort of direct invasion of fairy into court when we get to Sir Gawain in just a moment. She bids Arthur to punish the queen, who pales by comparison to her. The court agrees, and Triamor blinds Guinevere. She and Lanval leave the court and ride to the fairy isle of Olaroon, where he remains the rest of his days. Once a year, he mysteriously appears to joust. So, and that is kind of a long, but I think important summary of Lanval. So in the Franklin's Tale, we have to be a little more brief about it because I know we need to get moving on. You have the wife being forced to promise. She wants to remove the black rocks. She employs a magician. The magician releases her from her vow. In the Wife of Bath's tale, if you're familiar with the Wife of Bath's tale, the unnamed Arthurian knight is sent, having engaged in many misdeeds, to find out what women most want. He learns from a loathly lady or a hag that it's maestery, but he has to promise to give her what she wants. That ultimately is marriage. When in bed on their bridal night, he's confronted with the possibility of having her as she is, or young and beautiful part of the time. He leaves it to her. He gives her maestery or sovereignty in marriage. He gets her as he wants. In Outru and Atrun, and I think that this is really where we need to go now. Again, I'm really sorry about the sort of the way these slides got mixed up. Anyway, we're going to show you here in the opening lines, because these establish Tolkien's poem, which he bases on a Breton original, which he finds in a collection of Breton fairy tales. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the sourcing of Outru and Atrun, because, of course, Professor Flieger has already delivered a long lecture in the same forum on that a couple of years ago. So if you want to know more detail about that, you can see her remarks there. But in Outru and Atrun, you have this stock Breton Lay opening. Again, in Britain's land, you see Beyond the Waves and the Stony Caves. There's Tufnell Green. Harpers tell this story of old a lord in an arched hall with standing stones yet gray and tall. Again, I'm sorry, I'm slipping into Middle English pronunciation, although maybe that's how Tolkien would have liked it. There dwelt till dark his doom befell, as still the Briton harpers tell. The Lord, despairing of the fact that he has no heir, seeks out a witch, basically, a character that in Breton Lay is frequently referred to as a Corrigan. And of course, as Professor Pfleger notes, Tolkien adapted 2 other poems from the same collection of Breton folklore and developed that as the poems Corrigan 1 and Corrigan 2. Here, he does something really different with the conventions of the genre. He goes to the witch. He offers to pay her for whatever she can do to help him and his wife conceive an heir. She gives him a fertility potion, but promises that she won't take a fee now, but will take it later. She's basically giving him a money-back guarantee of a kind. I don't want to be accused of having tricked you. Autru, in turn, actually tricks his wife into ingesting the fertility potion on sort of an anniversary of their marriage. They go to bed, conceive children, twins who are born. When Autru encounters the witch again, she's no longer a hag, and she demands her fee, which is effectively to go to bed with Autru, to be with him. He refuses on grounds of fidelity to his marriage. She tells him he'll die. He claims that God alone will decide when I die. 3 days later, he's dead. Shortly thereafter, his wife is dead. We don't know what happens. We don't know what's happens to the children. I'm going to come back to this in just a moment because I think it's really important to touch briefly on some of the most important aspects of Tolkien's engagement with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because these show up in a variety of places in his own work. And again, I'm sorry about the slides. Right. So in his 1975 edition of the poem, Tolkien, in line 149, which is sort of bob and wheel stanza 7, if you're actually looking at that edition, or line 149, if you're looking at somebody else's edition, describes the Green Knight as, quote, as a fey man fell he passed, while other translators opted for something more mundane, or lacking that connotation as well as the denotation of fairy. Simon Armitage, you can see James Winnie and even back to Marie Boroff. There's no suggestion of fairy being essential. And if you can look at the passage, they focus on the fact that the Green Knight is, well, green. But for Tolkien, it was important to emphasize this, I think. If you look at his essay on fairy stories, he claims that such narratives can't be described by anything so narrow as stories about fairies, which is what one of the definitions one finds in the OED. It is too narrow to, even if we reject the diminutive size for fairy stories, are not in normal English usage about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy, that is fairy, the realm or the state in which fairies have their being. And you find that in his essays. I'm using the edition found in The Monsters and the Critics. In later, well, I should say earlier, in his work on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you see this in some of the introduction to the edition. You see this in aspects of the introduction to his translation, but most notably in his 1953 lecture, which became the essay in The Monsters and the Critics. Tolkien notes 2 things that I think are important to look at here. The role of King Arthur, he describes it as a fairy story. He's involved in the business as far as is possible to make the fairy story go. Basically, the fairy story is the vehicle, but Arthur is involved and it is a fairy story. So these elements are important the court setting, in particular the association with King Arthur. But what Tolkien's really interested in, and I think that we see this reflected in Outru and Atrun, is that as a vehicle, what we get from the fairy story elements of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and again, the green, if you're not from, I assume everybody here is familiar, at least broadly, with the narrative, is that the whole purpose is to test Gawain's morality, his piety, his commitment to truth, the commitment basically to his religion over his commitment to courtesy. And this is where, in the third fit, as Tolkien goes on to emphasize in the essay, the testing of the lady who, I guess, with whom he engages in the typical conventions of courtly love, lots of love talking, as well as offers of kisses, that he ultimately has to prove that he's more committed to truth, to fidelity, to the arrangement that he makes with the Green Knight, and then with his host Bertilac. Again, here we see another bargain between an agent of fairy and the protagonist. In this case, a classic quest knight, to exchange whatever they get. But of course, Gawain exchanges kisses for a fell fox pelt, as well as for other products of the host's hunting, but he doesn't reveal the green girdle that the lady gives him. And this is, of course, where he gets his nick on the neck when he stands the Green Knight's cut in response, which, of course, Arthur and the court celebrate. But I want to go back here to Atrun. What ultimately happens with this poem is that Tolkien differs from what we typically see in Breton Lay and in other romance, where if there's already a coupling or a marriage in place, this is often the case in Breton Lay, as in, say, the Franklin's Tale, it's validated. Sometimes in lots of other romances we see, including something like The Wife of Bath's Tale, we see the relationship forged. The knight, the once rapist knight, eventually is able to marry a Corrigan. She turns out to be a benevolent Corrigan once she's gotten what she wants, which is sovereignty or maestry in marriage from the knight in question. But it ends in a relationship. Here we have a relationship in place, but it ends in sadness. Some would say tragedy. Others, like Professor Flieger, are less sympathetic to Outru. But I think it's important to note that it's still a trick. The Corrigan tricks him. She doesn't tell him what her fee is going to be. Now, shame on him for making a rash promise. If he'd been a good reader of Breton Lay, he would have known that Corrigans are always going to get their due. Or actually, any agent of fairy does. If you want to think about Bertilac stroke the Green Knight and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, he gets the truth of Gawain's interaction with his lady, and he also gets his cut, though. Again, it was all, as we learn at the end of the poem, just ever purpose to frighten the court, especially Guinevere. But I found myself so much sympathetic to Outru as I am, I guess, understanding of the fix that he's in. But ultimately, his fault there, I guess his tragic flaw, if we want to impart some aspects of the tragic genre, is that he sinned. His morality is being tested in a way that's not unlike what we see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And he fails, ultimately, whereas Gawain, I guess, fails just a little bit. I want to close because I know we're running out of time, and I've gone on a bit long, and I don't want to do that because I want to make sure that everyone has time for their questions because I'm interested to hear them. With Beren and Luthien, and I'm going to focus here on, and again, I'm really sorry about these side things, but here we've got the opening lines of the version of Beren and Luthien, which is told to the hobbits by Aragorn in chapter 11 of the Fellowship of the Fellowship of the Ring. And I'm not going to read this in the interest of time, but what I think is interesting about this version of, or this kind of use of fairy romance, I'm not going to say Breton Lay specific, but there are, because obviously there's no reason to make reference to Brittany here. It wouldn't make sense, at least not directly for Tolkien here. But here we see Beren has gone wandering. And again, the parallels, I'm sure you all recognize the parallels between Beren and Aragorn, between Luthien and Arwen. But here he's gone wandering. He goes into fairy. He's cheered by it. And then he stumbles upon Luthien dancing. And then his quest to secure the Silmaril in order to gain Thingol's approval of their union ensues. This is an example of that other type, where we see the human element entering into fairy, sometimes explicitly seeking it, or in this case, sort of accidentally, but that emerges into a quest. Now, the last thing I'd like to say is that, of course, there are lots of other examples that we haven't been able to get to. Obviously, in The Hobbit, you have a quest motif, and there I would say it's an example, because certainly Bilbo isn't looking for it, of fairy coming, again, not to court in that case, but home. He doesn't ask to be visited by Gandalf and then the dwarves and to be engaged in a quest. But he is. Fairy has come to him. In The Lord of the Rings, we could argue that the same is true, but fairy is already there. Fairy has been at Bag End for many years in the form of the ring. So when Frodo is compelled by Gandalf to begin his quest to destroy the ring, I would contend that shifts a little bit more towards the model of the protagonist, not the human in that case, but the not typically heroic character going on a quest, seeking out fairy, even if only very grudgingly so. Now, again, you might interpret that aspect of it differently. Certainly, there are other narratives we might talk about that would be great for future discussion, like Farmer Giles of Ham, and of course, Tolkien's unfinished Death of Arthur, which moves us back a bit towards the epic, or at least the very broad scope romance. But ultimately, the last thing I'll have to say, and because I know I'm running over time now, is is that I think that Tolkien's engagement with medieval romance is not unlike that of medieval listeners and readers and writers of the genre. The value of romance, both those he studied, those he edited and translated, as well as those he composed, like Arthur and Netrune and Beren and Luthien, is that it articulates human encounters with the fairy other, in which Tolkien himself was just the sort of true believer on fairy stories, and he focuses on the importance of the treatment of fairy being sincere, who need not suspend his disbelief in order to engage with them, in order to take them seriously, in order for them to have meaning. Thanks. I can't see questions, so.
Thank you so much. No, that's fine. I will take a look at the questions. Oh man, so many fascinating concepts, and I have a bunch of questions, especially on all of Arthur, because I've done a little bit of work on that. So I'm going to indulge myself with one question to start. So you just touched a little bit on some gendered questions there. So I have one Fall of Arthur specific question, but then maybe you could comment more broadly on how issues of gender tend to work throughout these lays, and then how Tolkien plays with that. So specifically, I don't know, are you familiar with Alyssa House Thomas's chapter in The Influencing King Arthur?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not. I haven't had a chance to get to that yet.
I think you would love it. She makes a really powerful argument for some sources for Tolkien's Guinevere in The Fall of Arthur, and she looks at both Celtic and Germanic sources. And specifically, she refers to the court and sees some similarities to Tolkien's Guinevere. What do you think of that?
Similarities between the Corrigan?
Yes, the Corrigan and Tolkien's Guinevere.
I would need to go back, to be honest, I would need to go back and examine it again. But I think that I think that Tolkien has multiple Corrigans. I think you could describe his Guinevere as having elements of the Corrigan, in as much as her relationship with Lancelot is, well, let's just say problematic, to be really vague. You can certainly look at Galadriel as a kind of Corrigan. But I don't want to comment too much on that, because I know Dr. Flieger has gone into great depth on that in her own symposium. Safe to say that I would think that a character like Galadriel is a more benevolent, ultimately, a more benevolent Corrigan. But the thing about Corrigans, I think, and I think this really comes out in both, well, in all kinds of examples, but in terms of Tolkien's work, I think this really comes out with the Corrigan in Turin and Trun, and others, but is that they're fair. They might be tricksy, they might employ a kind of deception, although it's a kind of deception that seems to be, I don't want to say just or appropriate, but it seems to be par for the course. And I think that there are elements of that with Guinevere. They basically keep their promises. Now, at the same time, they will get theirs. I mean, the Corrigan there gets hers. Galadriel, she revels in the opportunity to have the ring. In a scene where she meets Frodo and Lorien at the mirror, and she doesn't take it, and I think that that's a gesture towards Tolkien's moralistic streak. I mean, as she said, she will remain Galadriel and diminish. If I may not be getting the line exactly right, but I think it's something like that. She remains who she is, but she does seem to restrain herself. I think one of the problems with Guinevere is, and again, I would really need to go back and review it, but is perhaps would you see there as being a lack of restraint there? I mean, I'm curious to know, because you have spent more time on it than I have, because I know it's a project of yours.
Alyssa really emphasizes Guinevere's possessive nature. She even ends up comparing her a little bit to a dragon, that she's trying to hoard both the love of Lancelot and the power that she gets from Arthur as his queen there.
Well, and I think you can see that in the Guinevere of Lanval. She obviously marrying Arthur, even the promise of marrying Arthur before she has done so, doesn't keep her from having her boyfriends, but she wants to use Arthur's power. Now, it's in a way, perhaps she's if there is an unfair Corrigan in the body of these fairy romances, and I think maybe that's the term to use in reference to Tolkien, because some of these are real quote unquote Breton Lay, others are not, but all of the romances he was particularly interested in I think, are fairy focused or fairy infused. And maybe she is an example, Lanval, not necessarily Tolkien's Guinevere in Death of Arthur, or Fall of Arthur, is perhaps an example of a Corrigan who is more malicious. Because as you can tell, like in Lanval, if you want to consider the Triamore, the fairy elf lover of the knight Lanval, as another potential Corrigan figure, you can see there that she is rather fair, and she is magnanimous. She could have stood on the fact that Lanval had broken their arrangement, that he'd fallen down on the job, but she doesn't. She steps in. I don't know if the Guinevere of Lanval would have done that for Arthur or any of her lovers. I don't know. I mean, we don't have evidence for that, but I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like the earlier Corrigans play the game. They play according to the rules of the game.
Right, and I think that for Tolkien, and I think that's why I wanted to try and connect Our True and a Troon with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that emphasis on the game as a vehicle for morality, not just form or courtesy, not just living up to the dictates of courtly love. Basically, sometimes you hear, I'll use a since it's appropriate to Tolkien, I'll use a rugby metaphor. Frequently, rugby coaches talk about practicing skills under pressure. When you're tired, when you're stressed, can you do what you're supposed to do? If you're Gawain or you're Our True, can you perform in a way that's consonant with what you're supposed to be, who you're supposed to be, the identity reputed of you? A lord who's faithfully married, who has to deal with the disappointment of not having children. Well, Our True falls down in that respect. He fails that moral test ultimately. Sir Gawain largely passes. What would we grade him? A 98%. He would have graded himself lower, but Arthur seems to consider it, a high A, even if not a perfect score. He largely remains true to his identity. In fact, and you could say that at the beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that identity isn't even realized. And I think that there are sort of shades of that in characters like Aragorn. He's the ranger, he has the lineage, he hasn't become the heir of Elendil. It's a process, his quest, not just the quest to aid Frodo and the Fellowship and the destruction of the Ring, but his quest is to realize his identity. The same is true of Gawain. At the beginning, we're dealing with a boyish or somewhat shield-geared Arthur. When he first encounters the lady, Bertilac's lady, he is questioned. Is this the Gawain of whom I've heard so much? Well, that has to reference a scope that we don't see directly in the poem. That's off the page or off the screen, as it were. We don't know that much about him apart from that he's Arthur's nephew. It's a process of becoming. With Our True, we have less to go on. We know he's a lord. We know he's faithfully married. We know that he's disconsolate about not having secured his legacy. We have a sense of how lords are supposed to act in romances, including Breton Lay, but he doesn't really realize that, and that's where the failure occurs. So it's a failure of identity, but it's also a failure of morality, whereas characters like Gawain and Aragorn and Beren succeed. I know we kind of wandered from Corrigans there, but
no, that's fine. Eric Bryan has sent in both a question and a comment that follow really well from this. His question is, do you think the concepts of good and evil are different in the romances of the medieval period than they are in Tolkien's use of this genre? It just seems like in the medieval stories, good and evil are more based on reputation, but in Tolkien, it's something different. And then he also wants to tie his question into what we're discussing right now with gender, so I'll read that too.
Okay.
I think the identities of these female figures depends on how you understand good and evil in the respective genres. Even in thinking about the Wife of Bath's tale, it is important that the tale is a copy of a Breton Lay, not a Breton Lay itself. The motivations of the authors and their view of good and evil shapes how we can look at these female figures.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. That's a lot to chew on. I wouldn't have expected anything less from Eric, though. Okay. Conceptions of good and evil. That seemed like as good a place as any to begin. As far as chronology, authentically medieval romances versus medievalist romances, I guess. Right. Well, I think it depends upon the romance. I think that in, say, Lanval is obsessed with reputation. He's obsessed with stuff. I mean, he is Arthur's steward, and he's described as extraordinarily generous. Now, it helps if you have the means to be extraordinarily generous. But at the beginning of the poem, he's deprived of that. And ultimately, when he does get something back, which is the fairy wealth and the fairy lover, he can't resist the temptation to tie what he actually has to his reputation. So I think in that respect, I would agree with Eric that in that case, morality has a lot to do with reputation. Now, granted, his motives are not immoral. I mean, you could say he's a strict moralist in one sense because he's so critical. He's so critical of Guinevere's infidelity that he has to leave court. But he can't really pick his moments, and he can't. There might have been a way to rise above the fray with Guinevere. He doesn't do that. He has to fight back. He has to respond with a reference to his unseen, unknown girlfriend. It reminds me of films in which, modern films in which characters are teased about the lack of a significant other, and they respond with something like, "Oh yeah, I've got a girlfriend. She lives in Canada." Or something. I'm thinking there of the Breakfast Club, but I know that's way off the page here. But that kept popping into my mind. He can't resist the temptation, and to me, we don't necessarily see that ultimately as a failing because he gets bailed out, and because I think his motives ultimately are moral enough, noble enough. So I would agree in that case it's tied to reputation. Whereas for Gawain, though, it is tied to reputation, but because he doesn't really have the reputation at first, I see that as much more akin to what we see in Tolkien's own uses of romance, where morality is about action. And again, we can make a kind of simplistic generalization that, well, obviously that makes sense. Tolkien, as a Catholic, he would have had a heavy investment in works theology. So, it's all well and good for Gawain to have the lineage, the tie to Arthur, for him to be willing to run off and engage in this fool's bargain. Again, the bargain, the beheading game, and the quest game, and the exchange game, sort of a multifaceted bargain. But if he doesn't perform, then he would have failed, and that's why Autru does fail. It's why Aragorn ultimately succeeds, why Beren ultimately succeeds, because they do become these things. So I do think that there's a difference, but I think it's a fairly fine difference, because we do see medieval examples, especially those that were clearly very important to Tolkien. Sir Orfeo, for that matter. Now, granted, his reputation has to do with the harp, but by proving that, by actually doing it, he was off in despair. He had, all but given up out in the wilderness, But then when he sees his chance, he takes it and he uses his skill. He embodies that identity. It's not so much a moral identity, but unless you can say that, sort of being true to oneself or one's ideal self represents a sort of a moral act or a kind of moral behavior. But I think that as for the gendered aspect of it, I think that Galadriel is a great example of works theology. She passes the test. Now, she sets up the test, and Frodo, apart from knowing that lots of different people want the ring, and perhaps not being able to know what to exactly expect out of Galadriel, because though she's elven and of great power, and his experience of the elves so far has been pretty positive, she also has the reputation that's articulated before the Fellowship enter Lothlorien that she's a witch, that basically she's a Corrigan. But she doesn't realize, I guess, the negative potentiality of her Corriganness. I don't know how to turn that into an adjective. But
again, fair and fell as Fey woman.
Right. Whereas in Lonval, for example, it's the benevolence, but that is of a type. It's the benevolence of the loathly lady turned beautiful elf queen wife lover in The Wife of Bastel. It's of a type. I don't know if it's put to as sincere a test as it is in Tolkien's own uses of romance. That might be the real difference, both in terms of the gendered element. Although, again, it's poor Itrun, as Professor Flieger said, and I agree. Itrun doesn't know that she's being tricked. Right. R2, he's going to a witch. Obviously it conjures up more recent images of Macbeth, or any instance, going to this, seeking out the supernatural for your own purposes. Maybe they're idealistic purposes. Maybe they have something to do with a respect for someone else and for marriage, in this case his wife, and for marriage. But ultimately, there is something selfish. Again, we see that Tolkien deals with that obviously in his account of how the kings of Gondor dwindled. Too concerned about heraldry and about sort of ceremony and appearances, about that same kind of reputation, and they failed the real test of of preserving their house.
Right.
So, yeah.
Let me jump in here because Joe asks a really good specific question that I think gets at the...
I was hoping for all vague questions. Sorry.
No, that's fine. But Eric asked that bit about the change over time, and Joe asks a very specific aspect of that, which is what happened around 1800 that made romance change its meaning so much?
Oh, gosh. I feel like I'm back in comprehensive exams now.
Right. Yeah. Jane Austen.
Yeah. You get a okay. That's fair. You get a more authentic feminine perspective. It's less female perspectives as portrayed by male writers, through female characters crafted by men. I mean, obviously there are earlier examples, but I can see a sea change there. Joe, is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, if you want to write a quick follow-up, you can, Joe. I suspect that there are material conditions that we could look to also, perhaps, women of a certain class having more education and more leisure to be able to produce these things, and then having an audience for them and so forth. But yeah, many ways that we can look at it. Let's go a slightly different direction for a moment. We probably only have time for maybe 2 more questions.
I'm happy to talk as long as people have questions, but yeah.
Okay, cool. So Coley Porter asks, how do you see the relationship between the entry into Fairy and the underworld journey? They seem distinct in, say, the Moria chapters versus the Lothlorien chapters, but they are seemingly indistinguishable in Sir Orfeo.
No, I think that's to sum up, I agree. No, I mean you can conceive of. I mean, if you go back to on fairy stories, the part I didn't quote, Tolkien goes into depth about, as fairy being the place where the representatives of fairy have their being. He does, he mentions dwarves, he mentions elves, he mentions all kinds of, of creatures. You could look at Moria as a bit like Our True and a Troon. It's fairy gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a human error in the in Our True and Our True in a Troon. Whereas, I mean, I guess you could blame it on the dwarves. I mean, they were supposed to have dug too deep. And thereby messed with forces that they ought not have messed with. But it's I guess it had potential. I mean, I don't know. I think it was corrupted. It was made an underworld by corruption, not necessarily by nature, apart from the fact that it is literally underground. But it's not like the underworld of the classical Orpheus myth. I don't think. I find it. I don't know. I see differences there, but in Sir Orfeo, these are one and the same. It's the perilous realm. But it's also the marvelous realm. I mean, the fairy king of Sir Orfeo bears a crown made from one otherwise unidentified and unidentifiable jewel, or just a really big stone that's been carved into a crown. The castle shimmers. I mean, it's a fantastically beautiful place, but it's also horrific. He sees upon entering the evidence of all of the people, not just his wife Herodes, but all of the people who have been seized and taken into fairyland, mangled bodies and, expressions of horror. But at the same time, there's that beauty. And I guess you see that sort of summed up in Galadriel. And it's a beautiful place. It ultimately, for the Fellowship, is a safe place for the time being, but it's also a place of testing.
Mm.
Would Frodo give Galadriel the ring? Mm-hmm. It seems to evoke, more doubt and despair and paranoia in Boromir. Obviously, Gimli is very suspicious of the whole place and the whole endeavor because he hasn't started his bromance with Legolas yet.
Yeah. Now, tell me if I'm wrong here. It seems to me that there also are some interesting implications of the interactions among three different sort of views of afterlife and underworld. So there's sort of the classical view of the underworld, and then there's a Christian view of the afterlife, but there's also Tolkien's questions about what is it that happens to elves, what is it that happens to men who have the gift of death, and so forth. So doesn't that complicate where fairy can be located and who goes into the underworld and what souls you encounter in those different realms?
Yeah, I think it does, but at the same time, hearkening back again to Tolkien's essay, you can't encompass fairy. He refuses to even try to put an exclusive definition on it because it contains so much, and moreover, it has the characteristic of great and expansive potentiality. Mm-hmm. It could contain so much. So I think it could contain, a classical notion of the underworld. It could contain an other world, in a way, both Rivendell and in a bit scarier and maybe more authentically medieval fairy forest way, Lothlorien does. Yeah. But it could also include either a Christian notion of heaven, a Norse pagan notion of Valhalla, although that's a very specific kind of heaven, if we can call it that, as well as what's beyond the sea,
right?
Where the elves and only Bilbo and Frodo and Gandalf get to go. I think it can encompass all of those things. So it does complicate it because each different other world, each different fairy realm has its own rules, has its own qualities, has its own potential perils, even if those perils are, as in the case of the beyond the undying seas where the elves go, is just that it's unknown to the primary perspective of Middle Earth. Yeah. Or what remains. It's Sam's perspective, it's the Hobbit's perspective, and it's the perspective of men. Aragorn knows a bit about it, a bit more than most, but for most, it's just this fair or potentially fell unknown. Yeah. It's just really, really unknown from their perspective, anyway.
Well, oh man, I have several more questions, and there are a few more, but unfortunately I need to get going myself. So we'll have to let go of the questions about Éowyn and about Hel, and I have some other questions about modernization and so forth. But thank you for sparking all of these really good ideas. That's what a good talk does, right? Is want us to keep the conversation going.
I'm glad. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm sorry for the roughness of the slides. Sorry if we get a little bit.
It's all right. You told me earlier that you were working on them in the midst of a tornado, so I think that's a fairly good excuse.
Herky jerky a little bit, but so anyway, yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody for for the great questions and just for the opportunity to talk to you about this. I really think it's a fascinating subject that we could spend lots and lots more time on.
We could. Very good. And hopefully we'll have some chance to do so in the future. All right. Well, maybe we will see you at Mythmoot, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
All right. Take care. Thanks everyone for being here. Goodbye for now.